My name is Charles Dubois, and I am 69 years old. After I paid the final installment on my daughter's $95,000 MBA degree, she threw a party in the backyard of the house I built with my own two hands. When the last guest finally left, she and her husband sat me down at my own kitchen table and handed me a spreadsheet. They told me I had 30 days to start paying them $2,000 a month in rent or I had to get out. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just made one phone call that changed everything. 1 week later, the new landlords arrived. Before I tell you what happened next and describe the look on my daughter's face when she realized what I had done, please let me know in the comments where you're listening to my story from. And I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that a child's ambition should never come at the cost of their gratitude. The party was in full swing by the time I came out of my workshop. Music I didn't recognize with a heavy pulsing beat vibrated through the floorboards of the deck I had built with Rose 30 years ago. My daughter Amara stood in the center of a circle of friends from her new corporate world. They all held glasses of champagne, laughing at something her husband Kyle was saying. Amara was glowing. She wore a white dress that probably cost more than my first car, and she looked every bit the successful executive I had sacrificed everything for her to become. I felt a surge of pride, but it was quickly followed by a cold, sharp pang of distance. She was the star of this universe, and I was just the aging planet she used to orbit. I tried to navigate through the crowd, carrying a tray of barbecue sliders I had spent the morning preparing. A young man in a tailored suit, a friend of Kyle's, bumped into me without an apology. He was busy gesturing towards my house, speaking loudly to his companion. "The bones are good," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But you'd have to tear it all down, of course. Imagine a sleek modern duplex right here. You could clear $1.5 million easy." I froze my hand, tightening on the tray. They were talking about my home, Rose's home. They were carving it up and selling it for parts right in front of me in my own backyard. I looked for Amara, hoping to catch her eye, hoping to see a flicker of defense for the place she grew up in. But she was laughing, completely absorbed in her own shining moment. She didn't even notice. I set the sliders down on a table and retreated to the edge of the yard near the rose garden. It was the one part of this property that was entirely my late wife's creation. The bushes were a little overgrown now, the weeds creeping in at the edges. Amara and Kyle had no time for gardening. Their lives were a series of meetings, networking events, and business trips. They had moved in with me over a year ago, a temporary measure they had said to save money after their lavish wedding. But their expensive cars were now permanent fixtures in my driveway, and their designer clothes filled the closets that Rose and I had shared. The house had started to feel less like a home and more like a high-end hotel where I was the live-in maintenance man. Earlier that day, Kyle had clapped me on the shoulder, not with affection, but with instruction. "Hey, Charles," he'd said, "make sure the lawn looks sharp for the party, okay? We have some important people coming." Important people. I looked out at the sea of strangers in my yard. Not one of them had come over to shake my hand to thank me for hosting. I was just part of the scenery. The old black man who came with the property. My mind drifted back to my workshop, to the scent of sawdust and old memories. On my workbench sat the old rocking chair I was refinishing. It was Rose's favorite. She used to sit there on the porch watching the sunset while I worked in the garden. She was the one who believed in Amara so fiercely. "She's going to do great things, Charles," she would say. "We have to give her every chance." And I did. After Rose passed, I made it my life's mission. Every penny I had, every drop of sweat went into giving Amara the life Rose dreamed for her. That $95,000 degree was the final brick in the castle we had built for our princess. I had drained my retirement accounts. I had even taken out a reverse mortgage on this very house, a secret I kept to myself. A dangerous gamble on my daughter's future success. And I had assumed her gratitude. Amara finally broke away from her friends and walked over to me. She didn't hug me. She just adjusted the collar on my shirt.
"Dad, are you okay?"
"You look a little lost." Her voice was flat, impatient. "I'm fine, honey," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm just so proud of you." "I know," she said, her eyes already scanning the crowd, looking for someone more important to talk to. "Oh, Kyle needs me. Try to mingle, Dad. Don't just stand over here by yourself. It looks strange." She turned and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing alone by her mother's roses. Hours later, the last car pulled away, leaving a profound silence in its wake. The backyard was a disaster of empty bottles and discarded plates. Inside, Kyle was at the kitchen table, his laptop already open, the screen glowing with charts and numbers. Amara was next to him, her party glow replaced by a hard, businesslike expression. They looked like a corporate merger, not a married couple. "Dad, sit down," Amara said, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "Kyle and I need to talk to you about something important." I sat, a feeling of dread coiling in my stomach. I thought they were going to talk about moving out, about finally starting their own life. I was wrong. Kyle turned his laptop towards me. On the screen was a spreadsheet full of line items: property taxes, homeowners insurance, utility bills, maintenance estimates. My name was at the top next to a column titled Current Contribution, which showed only my modest Social Security income. Charles Kyle began, his voice smooth and rehearsed like he was delivering a pitch to an investor. "We've been running the numbers on this property. From a purely financial standpoint, it's an underperforming asset. The overhead is substantial, and your income doesn't cover your share of the expenses." I stared at him, confused. "My share, Kyle, this is my house. I own it, there is no my share." Amara sighed, a sound of deep theatrical frustration. "That's the old way of thinking, Dad. We have to be practical. Kyle and I have been carrying the financial burden of this house for a year. We've been paying for groceries, the high-speed internet. You use the premium cable. It's not sustainable." I felt the blood drain from my face. I never asked you for any of that. You offered. You said you wanted to contribute." "Contributing is one thing," Kyle said, taking over again. "Subsidizing is another. Amara has her student loans to think about now. We have to build our future. We can't be anchored to the past." Anchored to the past. That's what I was to them, an anchor, not a father. Then Amara delivered the final blow. She slid a printed copy of the spreadsheet across the table. One line at the bottom was highlighted in yellow. "Resident contribution requirement, $2,000 per month. We think this is more than fair," she said, her voice cold, devoid of any emotion. "It's what a room would rent for in this neighborhood, probably more. You have 30 days to make the first payment. If you can't, well, you'll have to look for a more affordable living situation. We need to maximize the potential of this house." I looked from the paper to my daughter's face. I searched for a sign. Any sign of the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders in the very yard where she had just hosted her party. I saw nothing, just a stranger with my daughter's eyes, a stranger who had calculated my worth and found it lacking. My love, my sacrifice, my entire life's work building this home for her, none of it mattered. It hadn't even earned me a place in their financial plan. All the pride I had felt just hours before curdled into a grief so profound it stole the air from my lungs. My wife was gone. My daughter was a stranger, and the house this sanctuary built on love had just been turned into a rental property where I was the first tenant facing eviction. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. A lifetime of quiet dignity settled over me like a shroud. I slowly stood up from the table, picked up the spreadsheet, and folded it neatly in half. I looked my daughter in the eye. "I hear you," I said. And in that moment, in the deafening silence of my own kitchen, a cold, clear plan began to form. A plan to honor Rose. A plan to remind my daughter what a legacy truly is. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask them to repeat themselves. I simply stood there for a long moment, the spreadsheet still folded in my hand, its sharp crease a thin white scar. I looked at my daughter Amara, and for the first time I felt like I was looking at a complete stranger. The bright, loving girl I had raised was gone, and in her place was this cold, calculating woman with a business plan for my life. Her eyes, the same deep brown eyes as her mother's, held no warmth, no flicker of doubt or shame. They were the eyes of a CEO evaluating a failing department, and I was the department being downsized. Her husband, Kyle, sat beside her with a small, triumphant smirk on his face. The look of a man who had just closed a successful, if hostile, takeover. The ticking of the old clock on the wall, the one my mother-in-law had given us for our wedding, seemed to grow louder in the silence. Each tick counting down the seconds of the life I thought I had. I could almost hear Rose's voice, a soft whisper from a time when this kitchen was filled with the smell of baking bread and laughter, not the cold scent of betrayal. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. It wasn't a sigh of defeat. It was something else, something harder. It was the sound of a door closing, a final heavy door shutting on the past. Without another word, I turned from the table. My movements felt slow, deliberate, as if I were moving through deep water. I pushed my chair back in its legs, making no sound on the wooden floor I had laid myself. I walked out of the kitchen, past the living room where Amara's graduation photo smiled down from the mantelpiece. a monument to a love I now realized was entirely one-sided. I did not look at it. I did not look back at them. I could feel their eyes on my back, expecting an argument, a plea, and emotional outburst. I gave them nothing. I gave them only my silence. I walked to the back door, my hand closing around the familiar cool brass of the doorknob. This door led to my sanctuary, my workshop, the one place on this property that was still mine, a place built not for financial gain, but for the simple joy of creating something real and lasting with my own hands. As I opened the door, the rich scent of pine and cedar washed over me, a comforting balm on a fresh wound. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the solid click of the latch sounding like the cocking of a gun. The battle had been declared, and in the quiet solitude of my workshop, surrounded by the honest company of my tools, I would finally begin to plan my response. The hours that followed bled into one another, marked only by the slow march of moonlight across the dusty floor of my workshop. I didn't turn on the main overhead lights. I didn't want their harsh, honest glare. I just sat on a low stool, the same one I'd used for 50 years, surrounded by the silent, steadfast company of my tools. My saws hung on the wall like dormant soldiers. My hammers and chisels lay in their designated spots, their worn wooden handles shaped by the grip of my own hand. These were things I understood. They were honest. They did what they were meant to do. No pretense, no betrayal. My mind kept replaying the scene in the kitchen. Amara's cold voice, Kyle's smug face, the spreadsheet that quantified my life into a liability. The pain was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating weight in my chest. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw them. And the grief was so sharp it felt like one of my own chisels was being driven into my heart. To escape it, I let my mind drift further back through the years, searching for a time when this piece of land was not a source of conflict, but a field of dreams. I remembered standing here with Rose right on this very spot when it was nothing but tangled weeds and red Georgia clay. We were young, barely had 2 nickels to rub together, but we had this land bought with every penny we'd saved. I remembered the sweat on her brow as we cleared it ourselves, her laughter echoing through the pines as she hauled away branches nearly as big as she was. "We're building our forever Charles," she'd said, her hands covered in dirt, her smile brighter than the midday sun. "A place where our family will always be safe." I could almost feel the phantom weight of the hammer in my hand as I framed the first wall Rose right beside me, holding the beam steady. We learned as we went. We made mistakes. There were splinters and bruised thumbs, and days we were so tired we fell asleep on the subfloor covered in sawdust, dreaming of the finished rooms. When Amara was born, we brought her home from the hospital to this house. I remembered holding my tiny daughter in the half-finished living room, pointing up at the exposed rafters. "Look, little bird," I had whispered to her. "This is your nest. Your father built it just for you. Nothing can ever hurt you here." How hollow those words sounded now. The nest had been invaded. The little bird I had sworn to protect had grown wings, and she was now trying to push the old bird out. The grief began to burn the edges of it, hardening into something else. It was the slow, hot burn of anger. Not a wild, shouting anger, but a deep, cold forge fire anger. The kind that melts down old metal so you can shape it into something new, something strong. They thought I was a relic, an old man to be managed and discarded. They had miscalculated. They had forgotten that the same hands that built this house from nothing could also, if necessary, decide its ultimate fate. My gaze fell upon a loose floorboard in the corner, one I had always kept that way on purpose. Beneath it lay a secret, a time capsule of our beginning. I knelt down my old knees, protesting, and pried the board up. There it was, the old iron box, cool and heavy in my hands. It wasn't locked. Rose never believed in locking things away from each other. I lifted the lid. The smell of old paper and fading ink filled the air. Inside, resting on top, were old black and white photographs of us during the construction. 2 smiling, hopeful kids against a backdrop of wooden frames and possibility. Beneath them were the blueprints, my own hand-drawn plans, the lines faded but still clear. And at the very bottom, the most important document of all, the deed to the property. I pulled it out, my fingers tracing the embossed seal. The paper was thick, official. I read the names typed in neat black ink. Charles Dubois and Rose Dubois, joint tenants with rights of survivorship. When she died, it became mine, wholly, legally, undeniably. My daughter's name was nowhere on it. My son-in-law's name was a foreign concept to this sacred text. As I held that deed, another memory surfaced, so clear and powerful. It was as if Rose were standing right beside me in the workshop, her hand on my shoulder. We were signing the final papers with the county clerk, a stuffy little office that smelled of dust and bureaucracy. I was nervous, my hands sweating. Owning something so completely felt like an immense responsibility. Rose must have seen the worry on my face. She leaned over and whispered to me, her voice full of a fierce protective love that was the bedrock of our entire lives. "Charles," she said, "listen to me. People will see this land, this house, and they'll see its value in dollars. But that's not its real worth. Its real worth is in its purpose. Make sure this house always protects the family, Charles. Not just serves it. Protects the family, not just serves it." The words echoed in the silent workshop, and suddenly everything became clear. The anger cooled, solidifying into pure, unshakable resolve. Amara and Kyle saw this house as something to be served by a resource to be exploited, an asset to be liquidated for their startup fund. They had forgotten its purpose, Rose's purpose, my purpose. They wanted to turn this sanctuary into a business transaction. They had handed me a spreadsheet, but I held the deed. I would not let them corrupt her legacy. I would not let them turn our home into a monument to their greed. I had to protect the family, but I realized now with a clarity that cut through all the pain that family wasn't just the people who shared my blood. It was the values we stood for. It was the community we were part of. It was the spirit of love and sacrifice that had been soaked into the very timbers of these walls. My daughter had made herself an outsider to that family. The house now had to be protected from her. I sat there for the rest of the night, the iron box open before me, the deed in my hand. I was no longer a grieving father. I was no longer a tenant facing eviction. I was the guardian of a legacy, and I knew exactly what I had to do. My plan would not be born of vengeance. It would be an act of preservation, an act of love, an act of honoring the promise I had made to my wife all those years ago. They had started this war with a spreadsheet. I would end it with a deed. The first light of dawn filtered through the grimy window of the workshop, casting long gray shadows across the floor. I hadn't slept. The night had been a long, slow journey through 40 years of memories, and I had emerged on the other side of it a different man. The deed to my home was still resting on the workbench beside me, its steadfast presence, a silent partner in the decision that had solidified in my heart. I knew what I had to do, but knowing and doing are two different things. For a long while, I just sat there watching the dust mows dance in the morning light, my old flip phone feeling as heavy as a brick in my pocket. My hand hovered over it a dozen times. A part of me, the father in me, screamed in protest. This was my child, my Amara. Making this call felt like a betrayal in itself, an admission of failure. A good father should be able to solve his family's problems without lawyers and legal documents. A good father should be able to reach his daughter's heart. I imagined her waking up coming to find me, her face full of remorse. I imagined her saying it was all a mistake, that Kyle had pushed her into it. I clung to that sliver of hope, that fantasy, because the alternative was too painful to fully accept. The alternative meant that the daughter I loved was truly gone. But then my eyes landed on the spreadsheet they had left on the kitchen table. I had brought it out to the workshop with me, this cold, cruel ledger of my worth. I picked it up. Its flimsy paper, a stark contrast to the heavy, dignified deed. I read the words again. Resident contribution requirement. Underperforming asset. It was the language of a hostile takeover, not of a family. They had already fired the first shot. They had already turned our home into a battlefield. My silence, my inaction would not be an act of love. It would be an act of surrender. And I thought of Rose's words again, as clear as if she were whispering in my ear. Protect the family. I finally understood. Protecting the family didn't mean enabling my daughter's greed. It meant protecting the very foundation of what our family stood for. Love, respect, and legacy. The house was the symbol of that legacy. To protect it, I had to fight. My hand was steady now. I pulled out my phone, flipped it open, and scrolled through the contacts until I found the name David Chenault. He was a fine young man, the son of my old friend Marcus, a sharp lawyer who had a reputation for being honest and fierce. I pressed the call button. It rang twice. A professional voice answered. Chenault Law. Good morning, I said, my own voice sounding strange and formal to my ears. This is Charles Dubois. May I speak with David, please? A moment later, David's familiar warm voice came on the line. Mr. Dubois, it's good to hear from you. Is everything all right? Everything is fine, son. I lied, keeping my voice even. I need to ask for your professional advice. It's about my property. I need to see you as soon as you can make the time. There was a brief pause. Of course, Mr. Dubois, David said, his tone shifting, becoming more serious. How about this morning? Say 10 or at my office. I'll be there, I said. Thank you, David. I ended the call and placed the phone back on the workbench. A profound calm settled over me. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a clear, cold sense of purpose. The path was now set. There was no turning back. David Chenault's office was on the 12th floor of a new glass and steel building downtown, a world away from the familiar scent of sawdust and soil that defined my life. The waiting room was quiet and tastefully decorated with abstract art on the walls and a view of the city spreading out below. It was the kind of place that made you feel like your problems were small, but the fees would be large. When a young receptionist called my name, I followed her down a hallway to a corner office. David stood up from behind a large mahogany desk as I entered, a warm, respectful smile on his face. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, but his eyes were kind. They were his father's eyes. Mr. Dubois, he said, extending his hand. Thank you for coming in. Please have a seat. Charles, son, I corrected him gently, shaking his hand. You're Marcus Chenault's boy. There's no need for formalities between us. He nodded, his smile becoming more genuine. Of course, Charles. Can I get you some coffee? Water? No, thank you. I'm fine, I said, sitting in one of the leather chairs opposite his desk. I placed my old worn briefcase on my lap, but didn't open it yet. The words I needed to say felt lodged in my throat. It is one thing to feel betrayed. It is another thing entirely to speak that betrayal out loud, to give it shape and sound and make it real. David sat down, his professional demeanor returning, but the kindness in his eyes remained. You said on the phone it was about your property. Is everything okay? I took a deep breath. No, son, it's not. I started slowly, my voice a little unsteady at first. I told him everything. I told him about Rose, about building the house, about our dreams for Amara. I told him about the sacrifices, the $95,000 tuition, the reverse mortgage I had taken out, believing I was investing in my daughter's future. Then I told him about the party, the coldness of my daughter and her husband, and the final crushing conversation in the kitchen. My voice didn't crack, but every word was heavy-coated in a grief that was still raw. When I was finished, I reached into my briefcase. I pulled out 2 documents and placed them side by side on the polished surface of his desk. The first was the deed to my home, its old, thick paper, a testament to its history. The second was the spreadsheet Amar had given me, its crisp white paper and sharp black font, feeling like a violation. David looked at me, his expression a mixture of sympathy and a quiet, simmering anger on my behalf. He said nothing for a long moment. He just looked from my face to the 2 documents on his desk. Then he picked up the spreadsheet. He read it carefully, his eyes scanning each line item. A muscle in his jaw tightened. He set it down gently, as if it were a piece of contaminated evidence. Then he picked up the deed. He read it with the same focused attention, his fingers tracing the names. He looked up at me, his face cleared of all emotion, now replaced by the sharp, focused look of a lawyer. Charles, he began, his voice firm and clear. Let's start with the legal facts, so there is absolutely no confusion. First, this deed is ironclad. The property located at 452 Juniper Street was purchased and held by Charles Dubois and Rose Dubois upon Mrs. Dubois' passing sole ownership transferred to you. Your name is the only name on this title. Your daughter Amara has 0 legal ownership claim to this house. Her husband has even less. Is that clear? I nodded, a small bit of the weight on my chest lifting. Yes. Good. He continued, leaning forward. Second, the reverse mortgage. I assume they know about this. I don't think so, I admitted. I never told them. That's probably for the best, he said. A reverse mortgage is a lien against the property's equity. It's a loan that becomes due when the owner you either sells the property or passes away. The bank has a claim to be repaid from the proceeds of the sale, but it does not give them or anyone else ownership rights. As long as you live in that house and pay your taxes and insurance, you are the owner. Period. He paused, then gestured to the spreadsheet. This document, he said, his voice laced with professional contempt, is legally meaningless. It is, however, an astonishingly clear piece of evidence of intent. In a court of law, a prosecutor might call this a textbook example of an attempt at elder financial abuse. It's an attempt to extort money from you under the threat of making you homeless. The words hung in the air. Elder financial abuse. I had never thought of it in those terms. It sounded so clinical, so harsh, but it was the truth. David leaned back in his chair, his focus softening slightly. So the law is entirely on your side, Charles. You could have them legally evicted for trespassing if they refuse to leave. We could send them a cease and desist letter tomorrow. They have no leg to stand on. He paused, looking at me intently. The real question is, what do you want to do? This was the moment, the crossroad. I could choose the path of anger, of eviction, of severing all ties, or I could choose something else. I thought of Rose's words, the promise I had made to myself in the workshop. I don't want to destroy her, David, I said, my voice quiet but firm. She is still my daughter, no matter how lost she's become. But I cannot let this stand. I can't let them take what Rose and I built and turn it into nothing more than seed money for their next venture. It's not about the money. It's about respect. It's about legacy. I want to honor my wife. I explained to him the promise Rose had extracted from me, that the house should protect the family, not just serve it. I told him how Amara and Kyle only saw it as something to serve their ambitions. David listened, nodding slowly. He looked genuinely moved. To protect the family, not just serve it. He repeated softly. My own grandmother used to say something like that. He tapped a pen on his desk, thinking, Okay, Charles, I understand. This isn't just about getting them out. It's about preserving the soul of your home. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. Eviction is one option. It's clean, but it's brutal, and it doesn't solve the bigger problem. They'll just move on, thinking they were cheated out of something that was rightfully theirs. They won't learn anything. He turned back to face me. But there are other options, more creative ones. We're in a unique position here. You have total control of a highly valuable asset in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. My heart started beating a little faster. This was it. The shift from defense to offense. What kind of options? I asked. Well, David began, a thoughtful, strategic glint in his eye. You could sell it, of course, take the money and live comfortably for the rest of your days. Or you could do something that makes a statement, something that honors Rose's wishes in a very public, very permanent way. There are organizations, community land trusts, nonprofits that are desperate to get properties like yours to preserve affordable housing or create community spaces. They fight against the very kind of gentrification that has your son-in-law seeing dollar signs. A new idea, a new possibility began to take root in my mind. It was a radical thought, but it felt right. It felt like something Rose would have smiled at. It was a way to protect the house, not just from my daughter, but from the world that had corrupted her. Tell me more about these trusts, I said, leaning forward in my chair. For the first time in days, the suffocating grief began to recede, replaced by the clean, sharp air of a new purpose. The plan wasn't fully formed yet, but standing in that office with a strong ally by my side and the memory of my wife's promise as my guide, I knew I was no longer a victim. I was a builder again, and I was about to build a fortress around my wife's legacy. After my meeting with David, I came home with a heavy heart but a lightened step. I had a plan. I had an ally. And most importantly, I had a purpose that was bigger than my own pain. David's advice was simple. Let them show their hand. Don't argue. Don't engage. Just observe. Document everything. Their greed will make them careless. He was right. The change in the house was immediate. The false pleasantries stopped. The air grew thick with a cold, tense silence, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. And then the little attacks began. It started with a post-it note on the refrigerator stuck right next to a magnet Amara had made for me in kindergarten, a clumsy clay handprint that I had cherished for over 20 years. The note was in Amara's perfect corporate handwriting. Rent due first of the month, 25 days remaining. I looked at this bright yellow square of disrespect and felt a fresh stab of pain. This was my daughter writing a rent reminder to her own father in the house he built for her. I didn't take it down. I just took out my phone as David had instructed and took a clear time-stamped photo. A few days later, another note appeared next to it. Late fees will apply. Then another. Please note that failure to pay constitutes a breach of residency. It was as if she were communicating with a deadbeat tenant, not the man who taught her how to ride a bike in the driveway just outside. Each note was another photograph, another piece of evidence added to the growing file on my phone. Their next tactic was more insidious. They started having loud conversations always when they knew I was within earshot. I'd be in the living room trying to read and they would be in the kitchen, their voices carrying clearly. I was looking at some designs online, Kyle would say, his voice full of false enthusiasm. Once your dad's room is freed up, we could knock down that wall and make a huge master suite. Think of the resale value. Or a home gym, Amara would reply, her voice just as loud. I've always wanted a Peloton. I would just sit there, my book open on my lap, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm of fury and grief. But I would discreetly slide my phone from my pocket, place it on the end table beside me, and press record. The first time I did it, my hand trembled. It felt like a violation spying on my own child. But then I heard Kyle laugh and say, he'll have to downsize to a tiny apartment anyway. We'd be doing him a favor by taking this big old house off his hands. And the trembling in my hand stopped. They were not my family having a private conversation. They were business partners discussing the disposal of an inconvenient asset. And I was simply gathering data. The final escalation, the act that solidified their utter lack of respect, happened the following week. I was in my workshop sanding down Rose's rocking chair when I heard unfamiliar voices in the house. I walked inside to find Kyle giving a tour to a stranger, a man in a slick suit with a clipboard and a measuring tape. Kyle didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. Charles, he said with an unnervingly bright smile, this is Mr. Davidson. He's a top real estate agent in the area. We're just getting a preliminary market appraisal for our financial portfolio. You know, Mr. Davidson gave me a cursory nod, his eyes already scanning the living room, dismissing my life's possessions as clutter. Good structure, he said to Kyle, ignoring me completely. You'd need to gut the kitchen, obviously, and this paneling is dated, but the location is everything. I stood there, a ghost in my own home, as this stranger walked from room to room pricing my memories. He pointed out the inadequacies of the bathroom Rose and I had tiled ourselves. He called the bedroom where my daughter was born a convertible office space. The violation was so profound, so absolute, that the anger inside me burned away the pain, leaving only a cold, hard clarity. They were not just trying to push me out. They were trying to erase me, to erase Rose. The agent then came to the door of my workshop. He peered inside at my tools, my stacks of lumber, the half-finished projects. He wrinkled his nose. And this, he said with a dismissive wave of his hand, could be converted back into a two-car garage that would add significant value. I didn't say a word. I just looked at Kyle, my expression unreadable. I let him see me standing there taking it all in. I wanted him to think I was defeated, a helpless old man watching his world being dismantled. I let him underestimate me. It was the greatest weapon I had. As they walked away discussing commission rates, I took out my phone. I didn't have a recording this time, but I made a detailed note with the date, the time, and the agent's name. It was more than enough. David had told me their greed would make them careless. He was right. They had just handed me all the proof I would ever need. The moment that erased all doubt, the moment that turned my quiet resolve into a weapon, came on a Tuesday evening. The sun had just set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, the kind of peaceful twilight that Rose and I used to watch from the porch. I was in my workshop. The door cracked open just enough to let in the cooling air. I was sharpening the blade of an old hand plane, the rhythmic scrape of steel against stone, a familiar meditative sound. The house was quiet. Amara and Kyle had been working late, and for a few blessed hours, the space felt like my own again. Then I heard their car pull into the driveway, followed by the sound of their voices on the back patio, just outside the workshop door. They must have thought I was in the main part of the house watching television. They spoke in low, confidential tones at first, but as they settled into their patio chairs with glasses of wine, their voices grew louder, more careless. I kept working the sound of my sharpening stone, covering any small noises I might make. At first, it was just typical work chatter complaints about their bosses and talk of stock options. Then I heard Kyle mention my name. I froze my hand stilling on the plane blade. Has Charles said anything more about the rent? Kyle asked. No, Amara replied, a weary sigh in her voice. He just gives me this look, this sad, disappointed look. It's unnerving. Let it be unnerving, Kyle said dismissively. Don't let him guilt you, Amara. This is a business decision. Are you starting to get cold feet? There was a pause. I held my breath, every fiber of my being straining to hear her answer. A tiny foolish part of me prayed she would say yes. I don't know, Kyle, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It just feels harsh. He's my father. He's an obstacle. Kyle's voice was sharp, cutting through the evening air. He's an old man sitting on a gold mine he doesn't know what to do with. Listen to me. The $2,000 a month in rent is just the first step. It's the leverage. Once he starts paying, he legally establishes a tenant relationship. It weakens his position. It gives us a foothold. My heart was hammering against my ribs. My hand moved slowly, silently toward the phone on my workbench. I remembered David's words, document everything. With a surgeon's care, I unlocked the screen, opened the voice recorder app, and pressed the bright red button. I placed the phone carefully on a stack of old rags to muffle any sound. A foothold for what? Amara asked, her voice sounding stronger now, the brief flicker of conscience already extinguished. And then Kyle delivered the final damning verdict, for the home equity line of credit. Honey, that's the real prize. I talked to a guy at the bank. Based on the market appraisal we got, we can pull at least $50,000 out, maybe more, once we demonstrate control of the property. That's our seed money. That's the capital for our startup. This isn't just about the rent, Amara. It's about getting our hands on the $750,000 in equity this place is sitting on. He's never going to use it. It's just sitting there dying. We can make it work for us. I stood motionless in the shadows of my workshop, listening to my daughter and her husband plot the theft of my entire life's work. They weren't just planning to push me out. They were planning to gut the financial core of my home, the value Rose and I had painstakingly built over 40 years to fund their own ambitions. The love, the sweat, the memories to them, it was all just a number on a balance sheet, a resource to be plundered. And what about him? Amar asked. What happens to him after we get the money? He'll be fine, Kyle said with a chilling lack of concern. He can get a small apartment somewhere. We'll even help him with the first month's rent if it makes you feel better. It's for the best for everyone. We get our future, and he gets a simpler life. I listened until their conversation drifted to other things, until they finished their wine and went inside. I stood in the dark for a long time after the silence of the workshop, feeling sacred. Then I reached for my phone and pressed stop. I put the phone to my ear and played it back my own private hearing. Hearing their voices again, stripped of all plausible deniability, was like a baptism in ice water. Every last drop of fatherly sentiment, every lingering hope that this was all a misunderstanding was washed away. There was no confusion. There was no mistake. This was who they were. The recording was more than just legal evidence. It was my liberation. It was the final brutal permission I needed to do what had to be done. Any guilt I had about involving lawyers, any hesitation about fighting my own child vanished. They had mistaken my quiet dignity for weakness. They had mistaken my love for foolishness. They had made a terrible, terrible miscalculation, and I now held the proof of it, a digital ghost of their own greed, ready to be brought into the light. The following week, David and I walked into the offices of the Atlanta Community Land. Trust, it was nothing like David's polished corporate suite. The office was on the ground floor of a renovated brick building in a historic neighborhood. The furniture was simple and functional. The walls covered not with abstract art, but with framed photos of community gardens, neighborhood block parties, and families standing proudly in front of newly renovated homes. It felt real. It felt like a place where people mattered more than profits. A woman with a kind, intelligent face and hair in elegant silver braids rose from behind a desk to greet us. Her name was Evelyn Peters, and she was the executive director. As we sat down in her modest office, she looked at me with a warm, perceptive gaze. David has told me the basics of your situation, Mr. Dubos, she said, her voice calm and steady. But I would like to hear from you. Why us? I took a moment gathering my thoughts. This was the most important part. I needed her to understand that this was not a spiteful act against my daughter. It was an act of devotion to my wife. My wife, Rose. She was the heart of our neighborhood. I began, my voice filled with a warmth I hadn't felt in weeks. She believed that a home wasn't just the four walls you lived in. It was the community you helped build. She organized the first neighborhood watch. She ran the bake sale at the church that paid for new books for the local school. When a young family moved in down the street and couldn't afford paint, Rose organized a crew of neighbors, and we all spent a Saturday painting their house for free. That was her spirit, generosity, community. She believed in lifting people up, not pricing them out. I slid a photo of Rose across the table, a picture of her smiling in her garden. Evelyn Peters picked it up and looked at it with genuine respect. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, I said. When my daughter and her husband, when they told me their plans for my home to sell it to the highest bidder to tear it down and replace it with a luxury box that none of our old neighbors could afford, I knew it would be the final betrayal of everything Rose stood for. Selling it for a pile of cash would feel like selling her memory. I can't do that. This house needs to continue her work. Your organization, from what David has told me, you fight to keep communities like ours together. You believe in homes for people, not just assets for investors. That's why I'm here. I want my home to continue to be a home in the truest sense of the word. David then took over, laying out the legal framework he and Evelyn had been discussing. What we propose, he explained, is the creation of an irrevocable trust. It will be named the Rose Dubois Legacy House. Hearing the name spoken aloud sent a shiver of pride down my spine. Charles will transfer the deed of the property into this trust. The Atlanta Community Land Trust will be named the sole trustee and administrator. Evelyn Peters nodded, her focus sharp. And in return, she added, looking at me, the land trust will purchase the development rights to the property from you, Charles. This means we are legally bound never to sell the property to a private developer for market rate housing. Its purpose will be locked in perpetuity. The funds from this purchase will be yours. It will be enough to comfortably pay off the existing reverse mortgage and provide you with a significant nest egg for your future. It's not the full market value he would get from a developer, David clarified, but it's a substantial fair amount that secures Charles's financial future while achieving his primary goal, preserving the home's purpose. Our purpose for the house, Evelyn continued, would be to provide stable, affordable housing for community-focused individuals. Think of a young teacher who works at the local school, or a struggling artist who enriches our neighborhood, or a social worker. People who build communities but are often priced out of them. The residents would be selected based on their contribution to the neighborhood, ensuring Rose's spirit of service lives on. It was perfect. It was more than I could have hoped for. It was a plan that turned my pain into a promise. It transformed an instrument of greed into a sanctuary of hope. They spent the next hour walking me through the paperwork, the dense legal language that would build a fortress around Rose's legacy. I understood every clause because it was built on a foundation. I recognized the protection of something precious. Finally, David slid the last document in front of me. It was the deed transfer. My hand was steady as I picked up the pen. This was it, the decisive move. I looked at the line, waiting for my signature, the name Charles Dubois. For a moment I saw Rose's hand next to mine, her reassuring presence guiding me. I was not losing a house. I was planting a tree, one that would shelter others for generations to come. I signed my name. The stroke of the pen was firm, clear, and final. I pushed the paper back across the desk. A feeling of profound peace settled over me. A peace I hadn't felt since before Rose died. I had fulfilled my promise. I had protected our family, the real family of values and community that we had built together. Evelyn Peters looked at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Thank you, Charles, she said softly. You have given this community and your wife's memory a beautiful, lasting gift. The week after I signed the papers was the quietest I have ever known. I moved through the house like a phantom, my presence acknowledged only by the occasional cold glance from Amara or a dismissive grunt from Kyle. They treated me like a piece of furniture they were waiting to have hauled away. They didn't know that the final arrangements had already been made, that the wheels of a new future were already turning. My silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the calm, focused silence of a man who knew the final outcome of a game his opponents didn't even realize they were playing. I didn't pack everything. I packed what mattered. From the bedroom I had shared with Rose for 40 years, I took down our wedding photograph. I carefully wrapped her collection of porcelain birds, each one a gift from me on our anniversary. From the kitchen, I packed her handwritten recipe book, its pages stained with flour and love. I went through my life curating the memories, separating the things with price tags from the things that were truly priceless. The expensive sofa. They wanted to replace the big screen television. They always had control of the state-of-the-art kitchen appliances. I left it all. It was just stuff. It was the shell of a life, not the soul. One afternoon, Amara found me in my bedroom, carefully placing Rose's old gardening hat into a small cardboard box. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a smug, pitting smile on her face. It was the look of a victor observing the vanquished. Finally packing up, Dad? She asked, her voice dripping with condescension. I was wondering when you'd finally accept reality. The first of the month is just a couple of days away. I didn't look at her. I just continued to fold a tissue paper over the fragile hat. She pushed off the door frame and walked further into the room, her arrogance filling the space. Don't worry, she said, her tone sickeningly cheerful. We'll take good care of our house. It's really for the best. You know, a big place like this is just too much for you to handle at your age. You'll be much happier in a small, manageable apartment. Every word was a small, sharp jab designed to reinforce her dominance, to remind me of my supposed helplessness. I felt a surge of hot anger, a desire to wipe that smug look off her face, to tell her exactly what was coming. But I held my tongue. I thought of David's advice. I thought of Rose's legacy. My victory would not be in a shouting match. It would be in the quiet, undeniable execution of a promise. I finally looked up at her, my expression calm, my eyes holding hers for just a moment. I let her see the sadness there, but I did not let her see the strength. "I'm just getting a few of your mother's things in order, Amara," I said, my voice, even just making sure they're safe. My quiet response seemed to fuel her confidence. She scoffed a short, ugly sound. "Right. Well, don't take too long. Kyle and I are already looking at paint swatches for this room." With a final dismissive glance, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking importantly down the hall. I stood there for a long time after she left, the silence returning. I felt a profound sorrow, not for myself, but for her blindness, for the catastrophic miscalculation she was making. She was so focused on the material prize, so sure of her own cleverness that she couldn't see the truth right in front of her. She thought she was watching a surrender. She had no idea she was witnessing the final quiet preparations for a revolution. I carefully placed the lid on the box of memories and sealed it shut. Everything was now in place. All I had to do was wait. I was gone before the sun came up. I left a key on the kitchen counter, not for them, but as a final symbolic gesture of letting go. I didn't need a key anymore. I drove away from the house I had built, the porch where I had kissed my wife, the yard where I had taught my daughter to walk. And I did not look back. My new apartment was small, clean, and blessedly quiet. It was filled with boxes, but the few things I had unpacked: the photo of Rose, her rocking chair. My favorite tools made it feel more like a home than that big empty house had in a very long time. As I sat by the window with a simple cup of black coffee, I knew exactly what was happening back at the house. The first of the month, the deadline. I could picture it perfectly. Amara and Kyle would be sitting at the kitchen table, the very table where they had passed their judgment on me. They wouldn't be eating the simple oatmeal I used to make. No, they would be having something expensive, something they considered a reward for their cleverness. Perhaps avocado toast on artisan bread or coffee from some exotic beans Kyle had ordered online. I could hear their conversation in my mind, the smug, confident tones of conquerors dividing the spoils. "Did you call the contractor about knocking down that wall between your dad's old room and ours?" Kyle would ask, sipping his coffee. "I want that master suite framed out by the end of the month." "I'll do it today," Amara would reply, scrolling through her phone, probably looking at designer furniture. "And I've scheduled painters for next week. I'm thinking a nice minimalist gray for the whole main floor. Something clean, something that doesn't smell like old memories." They would laugh. They would talk about the home equity line of credit as if the money were already in their bank account. They would plan the launch of their startup, a future funded by the legacy they had just destroyed. "I'm sure they mentioned me," a passing pitiful thought. "I guess he finally got the message," Kyle would say with a shrug. "It's a shame it had to be this way, but he'll be fine." We did what was necessary. They would feel powerful. They would feel in control. They would look around at the walls I had built, the floors I had laid, the garden Rose had planted, and they would see nothing but a dollar sign, an asset that was finally rightfully theirs. They were toasting to their bright new future, a future built on the ashes of their past, completely unaware that their eviction notice was already signed, sealed, and on its way. They thought the story was over. They had no idea that the most important chapter was about to knock on their front door. And I, sitting in my quiet new beginning, just looked at my watch. It was almost 10 hours, right on schedule. I was not there to see it myself, but David and Ms. Peters recounted the entire event to me with such clarity that I can play it in my mind like a movie. They told me that as they walked up the path I had laid with fieldstones 40 years ago, they could hear the faint sound of music and self-congratulatory laughter coming from the kitchen window. They were celebrating their victory, completely unaware that their world was about to be turned upside down. The doorbell, David said, chimed with a cheerful melodic sound, a stark contrast to the news they were about to deliver. Kyle opened the door. He was holding a half-eaten piece of toast, a smear of avocado on his lip. He had a confident, annoyed look on his face, the look of a man whose important breakfast had been interrupted by a lesser being. He saw David, a well-dressed black man, flanked by Ms. Evelyn Peters and her associate, and his expression immediately became dismissive. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone implying that whatever they were selling he wasn't buying. "Are you Kyle Peterson?" David asked, his voice calm and professional. "I am," Kyle said impatiently. "Look, if this is about a donation, we're not interested." Amara appeared behind him, drawn by the interruption. She looked from David to Ms. Peters, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "What's going on?" David met her gaze. "My name is David Chenault. I am an attorney, and these are my associates, Miss Evelyn Peters and Mr. Harris from the Atlanta Community Land Trust. We are here on an official matter regarding this property." At the mention of an attorney, Amara's posture straightened. She and Kyle exchanged a quick, knowing glance. They thought this was about me. They assumed I had hired some small-time lawyer to make a feeble last-ditch effort. Kyle's dismissiveness morphed into outright arrogance. He leaned against the door frame, a smirk playing on his lips. "Okay," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "I think I know what this is about." "If this is about my father-in-law, Charles Dubois, you can speak directly to us. We are handling his affairs now." David allowed a small, cold smile to touch his lips. "Actually," he said, the word hanging in the air for a moment, "we're not here about Charles Dubois' affairs. We're here on behalf of the new legal administrators of this property." That was the first crack in their composure. A look of genuine confusion passed between them. "The what?" Amara asked, her brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? We live here. This is our house." It was a lie, a desperate assertion of a reality that was already slipping through their fingers. This was Ms. Peters' cue. She stepped forward, her presence exuding a calm, unshakable authority. She held a leather-bound folder in her hands. "I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding," she said, her voice gentle but firm as steel. "My name is Evelyn Peters. As I believe Mr. Chenault mentioned, I am the director of the Atlanta Community Land Trust. As of 9 a.m., Tuesday 3 days ago, the property located at 452 Juniper Street was legally and irrevocably transferred into a trust. That trust is named the Rose Dubois Legacy House. The Atlanta Community Land Trust is the sole trustee and legal administrator." David told me the change that came over their faces was breathtaking. The color drained from Kyle's cheeks, leaving his skin a pasty, sickly white. Amara's jaw literally dropped, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "No," she stammered, shaking her head. "No, that's impossible. That's a lie. My father, he couldn't do that. He wouldn't do that. This is our house. I assure you it is very much possible, and it is the legal reality," David said calmly. He opened the folder Ms. Peters was holding and pulled out a document. "This is a certified copy of the deed transfer signed by the sole legal owner, Charles Dubois, and filed with the Fulton County Clerk's office. It is a matter of public record." He held it out for them to see, the notary seal and my own signature clear and undeniable. Kyle, the finance guy, desperately scrambled for a loophole, his mind racing. "The mortgage," he sputtered. "There's a reverse mortgage on the property. The bank has a claim." He looked triumphant for a split second, as if he had found their mistake. David didn't even blink. "The outstanding lien from the reverse mortgage was accounted for and has been settled by the trust as part of the acquisition agreement. It is no longer your concern." Every escape route was being sealed off. Every lie they had built their future on was being dismantled brick by brick right on their doorstep. Amara looked like she was about to be sick. "So what does this mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Ms." Peters answered, her tone still gentle, which somehow made the words more devastating. "It means that this house is no longer a private residence to be bought and sold. Its purpose in honor of your mother's legacy of community service is to provide affordable housing to individuals who contribute to this neighborhood. As the current occupants, you no longer have any legal right to reside here." She let that sink in before delivering the final crushing blow. "You could, of course, submit an application to the trust to be considered as tenants," she said, pausing for a beat. "However, given the evidence provided by Mr. Dubois, including detailed notes and a rather explicit audio recording of your intentions to fraudulently leverage this property for personal gain, I must inform you that it is a certainty your application would be denied." David then stepped forward and handed Kyle an envelope. "This is your official written notice," he said, his voice flat and final. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises. As of that date, the locks will be changed. Any possessions left behind will be considered abandoned and will be disposed of. We wish you the best in finding a new residence." And with that, they turned and walked away. David told me he didn't look back, but Ms. Peters did. She said Amara and Kyle were still standing in the open doorway, frozen the envelope in Kyle's limp hand. They were two statues of greed and arrogance standing on the threshold of a home that was no longer theirs. Their meticulously planned future shattered into a million pieces around them. David told me that for a full 10 seconds after they turned and walked away, Amara and Kyle didn't move. They just stood in the doorway, the eviction notice hanging from Kyle's fingers as if they were statues carved from pure disbelief. The professional calm of the encounter was shattered by a single raw sound, a scream. It wasn't a word, just a noise of pure animalistic rage that ripped from Amara's throat. The sophisticated MBA vanished, replaced by a furious, thwarted child. "No," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You can't do this. You can't just steal my house." David and Ms. Peters stopped at the edge of the driveway and turned back, their expressions impassive. Kyle, jolted into action by his wife's hysteria, seemed to find his voice, a voice trembling with a mixture of panic and impotent fury. "This is illegal!" he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at David. "This is coercion. We'll sue you. We'll sue the land trust. We'll sue my father-in-law for everything he has. He's an old man. He doesn't know what he's doing. You clearly took advantage of him, David." David told me, just stood there calmly and let him finish. He didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice. When Kyle finally ran out of breath, David responded, his tone as level and cool as a courtroom proceeding. "Mr. Peterson, you are, of course, welcome to pursue any legal action you see fit. However, I feel obligated to inform you that your father-in-law was represented by independent legal counsel, myself, at every stage of this process. We have a notarized affidavit signed by Mr. Dubois in the presence of witnesses attesting to his sound mind, his clear understanding of the agreement, and his unequivocal intentions. He was not coerced. He was empowered." The word empowered seemed to enrage Kyle even more. "We'll prove undue influence. We'll get him declared mentally incompetent." This, David said, was when he decided to end the conversation. He took a small step forward. "Before you spend a great deal of money on that particular legal strategy," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more serious, "you should probably consider the evidence that would be presented in court during discovery. For example, the multiple photographs of handwritten notes demanding rent, the detailed log of your conversations, and, of course," he paused for effect, "the audio recording." The mention of the recording was like a physical blow. Amara's screaming stopped abruptly. Kyle's face, which had been red with anger, turned a ghastly shade of white. They stared at David, their mouths slightly agape. "The recording," David continued, his voice relentless, "in which you and your wife explicitly outline your plan to use rent payments as leverage to gain control of the property, and then take out a line of credit against its equity to fund your personal business venture. I have to wonder, Mr. Peterson, which piece of evidence a judge would find more compelling in a case about undue influence? Your baseless accusations or a recording of your own voices plotting to financially exploit an elderly parent?" That was it. That was the checkmate. There was no argument left. There was no threat they could make. Their own greed, their own words had been turned into an inescapable trap. Kyle's shoulders slumped. The fight just seemed to pour out of him, leaving an empty, defeated husk. Amara stared at David, her eyes wide with horror, not at what she had done, but at the fact that she had been caught. The reality of her situation crashed down on her all at once. There would be no master suite. There would be no startup fund. There would be no $750,000 of equity. There was only this eviction notice and the public legal proof of her own monstrous betrayal. Her rage collapsed into desperate, ugly sobs. She turned to Miss Peters, her face streaked with tears. "Please," she begged, her voice now that of a pleading child. "He's my father. He wouldn't really do this. He wouldn't just throw me out on the street. It's a mistake. Please, just tell him we're sorry." David told me this was the saddest part of all. Ms. Peters looked at my daughter not with anger, but with a profound and weary sorrow. "Young lady," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, "your father did not do this to you. He gave you every opportunity. He gave you his entire life savings for your education. He gave you a home. This is the consequence of the choices you and your husband made. I'm sorry, but there is nothing more to be said." And with a final compassionate nod, she and David turned and walked to their car, leaving my daughter and her husband standing alone on the porch of the house they had tried and failed to steal. Their future had evaporated before their very eyes. 30 days later, the moving truck arrived. It wasn't from a high-end professional company. It was a cheap rented U-Haul its side, scarred with the marks of 100 other hurried, unhappy moves. I wasn't there to see it, but one of my old neighbors, Mrs. Henderson, called me later and painted a vivid picture. She said it was a gray, drizzly morning, the sky weeping, a soft, sad rain onto the lawn. A fitting backdrop for the quiet funeral of my daughter's ambition. Gone were the designer business suits and the air of effortless superiority. Mrs. Henderson said Amara wore old sweatpants and a stained hoodie, her hair pulled back in a messy, uncared-for ponytail. There were dark circles under her eyes. She moved with a listless, defeated energy, carrying boxes filled with expensive kitchen gadgets and designer shoes that now seemed absurdly out of place. There was no shouting, no anger left, just a hollow, bone-deep weariness. Kyle looked even worse. His usual confident swagger was gone, replaced by a sullen, hunched-over posture. He moved the heavy furniture with a grim, resentful silence, his movements jerky and inefficient. They didn't speak to each other. They moved around the property like two ghosts, haunting the scene of their own spectacular failure. The beautiful modern patio furniture they had bought was loaded onto the truck, looking cheap and forlorn under the gray sky. Mrs. Henderson said the most telling part was the silence. There was no friendly banter, no calls of lift with your knees. There was only the scrape of boxes on the driveway, the heavy thud of furniture being loaded, and the soft, persistent patter of the rain. They worked with their heads down, avoiding eye contact with the few old neighbors who watched discreetly from their windows. The whole neighborhood had heard the story. There was no sympathy for them, only a quiet final judgment. As the last box was loaded, Amara apparently stood for a long moment and just looked at the house. The house I had built, the home she had so casually tried to monetize. Mrs. Henderson couldn't see my daughter's face clearly, but she said her shoulders were shaking. It might have been from the cold, or it might have been from the crushing weight of what she had lost. It wasn't just a house. It was a history. It was a family. It was the unconditional love she had mistaken for a financial asset and had liquidated for nothing. Then, without a word, she got into the passenger seat of the truck, and Kyle drove them away, leaving behind nothing but an empty house and the echo of their own profound and self-inflicted ruin. A month passed. The autumn rains gave way to a crisp, clear November. My new apartment, the one I had found on the quiet Treine Street a few miles from my old neighborhood, began to feel like a home. It was small, just 2 rooms, but the morning sun flooded the living room, and from my window I could see a small park where children played after school. All my boxes were unpacked. Rose's rocking chair sat by the window, catching the best of the light. Her photograph had pride of place on my bookshelf. My tools were neatly arranged in a converted closet, ready for any small project I felt like starting. I had expected to feel a sense of triumph, a surge of satisfaction at having won, but it never came. When I thought of Amara and Kyle, I felt no pleasure in their defeat. I only felt a deep, aching sadness for the daughter I had lost, a sorrow for the choices she had made that led her so far from the values her mother and I had tried to teach her. Vengeance, I realized, is a hollow victory. It leaves a bitter aftertaste. What I felt instead was something far quieter and much more profound. I felt peace. It was a peace that came from a profound sense of relief. The constant low-grade tension that had filled my old house for the last year was gone. The weight of my daughter's expectations, of Kyle's ambition, of my own silent, simmering resentment, it had all been lifted. I slept through the night for the first time in months. I woke up in the morning, made myself a simple cup of coffee, and the only agenda for the day was my own. My life became a collection of simple, quiet joys. The smell of wood shavings from a small birdhouse I was carving for Mrs. Henderson's grandson. The taste of the coffee I could now afford to buy from the good roaster downtown. The sound of old jazz records playing on the small record player I had bought myself. I had paid off the reverse mortgage. The rest of the money from the trust was sitting safely in the bank, more than I would ever need. For the first time, I felt financially secure, but more importantly, I felt emotionally secure. I was no longer an asset to be managed or a liability to be endured. I was just Charles, a man in a quiet apartment living a quiet life surrounded by the few things that truly mattered. And it was enough. It was more than enough. This whole experience taught me a hard but necessary lesson. A house is built with wood and nails, but a home is built with love and respect. My daughter and her husband saw only the market value of the property, but they were blind to its true worth, a worth measured in 40 years of shared dreams and sacrifices. In the end, protecting the legacy my wife and I built meant letting go of the physical structure itself. It taught me that true wealth isn't what you own, but what you stand for, and that a legacy isn't what you leave to your family, but what you leave inside them. What do you believe is the most important legacy to leave behind? Share your thoughts in the comments below.